Today we have a beautiful game from Bobby Fischer. One thing I want you to look at in this game is the incredible harmony of pieces, how efficient his pieces work in this game, played in 1957. He was only 14. This was his first U.S. championship, which he won. So people didn't quite yet know how great Fischer was or was going to be. I had the GM title attached to his name here. He wasn't quite a GM yet, but he was playing at a GM level. His opponent is George Mortimer Kramer, who was a national master. Not his toughest opponent in this tournament, but that allows us to see sort of the beauty of Fischer's play and to really learn a lot from the game. Kramer has white, Fischer has black. Let us jump right in. George Kramer begins with knight to f3, knight f6, and we have symmetry on the board for the first four moves. Both sides have castled on the king side and fianchettoed their king's bishop. D3 from George Kramer, and it seems he wants to play the King's Indian attack. A lot of people seem to be playing this opening, at least in the United States at this time and place, including Bobby Fischer. So we get to see how Fischer plays against one of his own openings, the King's Indian attack. D6, we still have symmetry, E4, and now Fischer breaks the symmetry with C5, and this is like a Sicilian. Basically, it's similar to a closed Sicilian, although in a closed Sicilian, this pawn at f2 might already be at f4, and George Kramer is clearly aware of that. You can see in his future moves. First, he plays c3, preparing at some point perhaps to play d4. He can't play it yet because the e4 pawn would hang. Knight to c6 from Fischer, and here white plays knight to e1, and the better move is probably rook to e1, just defending that e4 pawn and trying to prepare d4. But I think what he was trying to do was to create that closed Sicilian position. The problem is this is a much slower way to go about it, and that gives Fischer a couple of tempo over the main line, closed Sicilian. And he plays rook to b8. This is a standard recipe against a closed Sicilian. Just play rook to b8, b5, b4, and try to open the b file, create a weakness on c3, open some vulnerable squares for the bishop at g7. f4 is played, and now knight to e8. This is a multi-purpose move. It allows the move f5 if white were to play, say, g4. The move f5 is often a good idea for black. It opens up the bishop's diagonal, and the knight can reroute to c7, where it can go to some key squares, support b5, and go to e6, etc. So it's a multi-purpose move and a good one. Bishop to e3 from white. Now bishop to d7, just defending the knight, getting the bishop developed. In case white plays e5, that knight would not hang. And now he's ready to play his strategy of b5, b4. Knight to d2, getting that last piece out. Maybe the knight wants to go to c4 after a move like a4. But Fischer beats him to the punch, plays b5, readying that b4 move we've been talking about. The best move for white here is probably just to play knight d to f3, then expand on the queen side with h3, g4, try to defend c3 with rook to c1. He's probably a little worse, but it looks like that's his best chance. Instead, he breaks in the center with e5, when his pieces really aren't ideally placed, this knight being on the back rank. And Fischer's pieces are well developed. His knight's on the back rank too, but it's in a better position to become active via the c7 square. So pawn takes e5. The idea, of course, is that now this pawn at c5 hangs, so white takes that pawn. ef4, rook f4. So material's equal, but just comparing the position, look at the king safety. Look how much safer black's king is compared to white's king now, with this open dark square diagonal leading right to it. Fischer plays knight to c7, and he already has a tactical threat. He's threatening to play knight to e6, which would fork the rook and the bishop. The rook could not defend the bishop, so it would cost him material. So he moves the rook back to f1, and now b4, continuing with the strategy of hitting c3 and opening up this long diagonal. Rook c1 is probably the best move here, but he plays queen to c2. The problem with this move, as we will see, is that now this rook is undefended, not only because the queen no longer defends it, but again, this knight on e1 really gets in the way of white's piece coordination. So the rook at f1 doesn't defend the rook at a1 at the moment, while black's pieces are the image of perfect harmony, each one working cohesive purpose. Pawn takes c3, pawn takes c3, and now knight to b5. So we see the knight went to e8, c7, and b5, and is now hitting this weakness at c3, and the pawn cannot advance because the bishop would just take the undefended rook at a1. So white plays a move that seems to solve his problems. He plays the move d4. And now, I mean, he's got the bishop pair. This seems to be a fairly strong central structure. But Fischer sees that it's a little rickety. You know, if he applies enough pressure, he can cause this to collapse. His next move is rook to c8, which places the rook opposite the queen. Yes, there's a bishop and pawn in the way, but now there are tactics available, and sort of a red alert should be going on in White's mind at this moment. White's best move here was probably bishop takes knight, a move you do not want to play because it further weakens his king and all these light squares, but it still probably was necessary. Rook takes bishop, knight e to f3. Black is definitely better, but the game's not over yet. But he plays the move queen to b2. He steps out of the aim of this bishop at c8, but he steps into the aim of the bishop at g7. And Fischer is able to immediately exploit that with a temporary piece sacrifice. Knight takes c3. When the queen retakes, then he played this beautiful move. Knight takes d4. And there are threats all over the board. The bishop at c5 is pinned by the rook at c8. So if the bishop were to take the knight, the rook would take the queen. He's threatening knight to e2 check, which would fork the king and the queen, and also reveal the bishop's attack on the queen. So that's a big threat there. So George Kramer plays queen to b4 to step outside of that threat. But now knight to e2 check hits the king and reveals an attack on this still undefended, because of the knight at e1, a1 rook. Now, white plays the king to h1. Well, what if he plays the king to f2? At the very least, maybe he could recover the knight at the cost of some king exposure in exchange for this rook, get a little bit of something. Well, there's a reason why that does not work, and it's this move, rook takes c5. Because after queen retakes, then bishop to d4 check. The knight defends the bishop, and the bishop forks the king and the queen. So that is why he has to play the move king to h1. Fischer immediately plays rook takes c5, queen takes c5, and bishop takes a1. The reason he takes here is that white was threatening bishop takes e7 at some point, which would hit some material there. So rook takes c5, bishop takes a1, and Fischer is up 2 healthy pawns with much better piece coordination. Knight e to f3, a move that is he wanted to play a long time ago. He only finally gets to it a little bit too late. Bishop to g7, rook to e1, hits the knight. Now the knight goes to c3. This knight on c3 is very strong, protected by the bishop at g7, and it creates a lot of annoying threats. He's threatening the a pawn at the moment. White goes ahead and grabs on a7, gets 1 pawn back. Bishop to e6. Fischer hits that pawn twice, so the pawn moves up. Queen to d6, so now he can develop his rook, maybe move it to c8. Queen to a5. Now bishop to d5, challenging the light-squared bishop on this long diagonal. And here white plays knight to b1. He wants to trade pieces and use his passed a-pawn to try to get enough counterplay to hold in this endgame. But Fischer's response throws cold water on that idea immediately. Plays the move rook to a8, attacking that queen, and where can the queen go, really? It goes to really the only square it can go, which is b4, offering the exchange of queens, but it does not bring him relief. Fischer takes the queen, pawn takes, and this next move is very strong. It's important to notice this knight on f3 is defending the rook on e1. That's a very key issue. So Fischer takes that knight off of the board. Bishop takes f3. And if white were to respond with bishop takes f3, the most natural move, then rook to a1 pins that knight. And now it's a pin because this rook is not defended, so he's just going to lose material. So because of that, George Kramer goes ahead and plays knight takes c3. But then after bishop takes g2 check, he went ahead and resigned, because after he takes the bishop at g2, Fischer would just take the knight at c3 and be up a bishop and a pawn. Really interesting how, George Kramer was a little inefficient with his moves. He played knight to e1 to get the pawn to f4. It was just a little too slow, and that's all a 14-year-old Bobby Fischer needed to really get those tactics rolling. Hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.